What's going on, guys? It's Fate, and of course, I got another audiobook to share with y'all here today. By the way, quick shout out to Bui. I just wanted to thank you for this audiobook recommendation. I found it enjoyable and unlike a lot of what I've checked out in the last several weeks. So thanks again, Bui, and back to the show.
This is Narcissus and Goldmund by Hermann Hesse, a well-documented and fairly substantial author of German origin. Now, I wanted to talk about our narrator outright here because we have a real special guest, so to speak, a special feature on the show, I should say. That is Simon Vance. And Simon Vance is possibly one of the most accomplished narrators I have featured here on the channel. He is extremely acclaimed, to say nothing else. We're talking about 17 Audi Awards, 77 audiophile earphone awards, and apparently he is number one for the male single voice Audi nominations to date. All of this is coming from a combination of his own website, the Earphone Awards accolades page, and a couple other sources based out of the Wikipedia, but I did actually go and check the sources themselves, not to mention Simon's own website. Now, Simon's website is actually pretty cool. I checked out his brief autobiography. He titled it The Life of Psy. And I would just love for you guys to go and check that out if you appreciate looking into our narrators. The link is in the description for Simon's website. Now, as far as Hermann Hesse goes, he is a very substantial author, German origin, wrote many experiential, spiritual, sort of coming to fruition types of books throughout his literary career. And what we're checking out today is somewhat understandably his most acclaimed book, at least in terms of international acclaim. I was perusing various little literature clubs and other such forums on the internet, and I found that he is a smidge divisive, mostly because we are in the wake of perhaps one of his most successful and influential eras, and there's of course always pushback, contrarian, hypercritical analysis, so on and so forth, but generally speaking, he is an extremely accomplished, successful, noteworthy author from history. He passed away in the 1960s, but generally speaking, he is a really interesting seeming author, and I want to check out more of his works in the future. I could actually pick up very quickly on this book within the course of listening to this audiobook that this was an author who was somewhat versed in a wide school of spiritual, theological, and philosophical beliefs, and that was cemented further by reading a few quick little biographical articles about him. Now, Narcissus and Goldmund, right? That's what we're reading today, and I want to talk about Simon Vance's narration. And sticking with our normal formula for the show, let's talk about his narration first off and foremost. Now, as you understand, we have an extremely skilled, experienced, and versatile narrator here today. The strengths are many. Starting small, there is a lot of solid modulation within the prose reading. That is to say that there is great intonation to match with the situations being depicted or covered by the prose. More dark and intense prose reading for more serious scenes, more perhaps whimsical, flowery, and light-hearted prose reading for situations and elaborations that were a bit more light-hearted, a little bit more flowery and conceptual. Then, of course, I always have to point out a wide breadth of voices from essentially a sex differing from their own. He did a very impressive job performing the female voices of varied kinds. There was a lot of emotional modulation, as well as breadth from the very youthful to the elderly, with emotions ranging from lust to fear and anger, which is very much in keeping with the themes of this book. I will say it was a very experiential book. And I want to elaborate on that actually in the quirks and drawbacks sort of section. It's a very experiential book, and that did affect how I felt about this particular narration, what we get out of it. But finally, probably the most important strength I want to mention here is that Simon provides immense modulation. He is able to bring the characters to life and capture them very articulately, and that is something you always want and something that should stick out when you are taking in a text that has been narrated for you. There are representations of characters from bright and innocent youths to the elderly that are ill and near death. It is a lot of different variation in the emotional modulation, but also just the energy, the level of air, breath, and tension applied to one's own vocal cords. There was a very good amount of highly skilled voice acting, particularly for the character Goldmund. Now, this isn't what I want to talk about in terms of one of the only drawbacks or quirks I could talk about in regard to such a well-done narration as this one. Due to the novel being more of an experiential, philosophical, and spiritual piece than anything else, the narrator's ability to voice act seems to go a little bit untested by this text. And I really do mean just a little bit, but we are missing out on a wider variety of characters that have larger-than-life voices, very animated and very eccentric or different voices. We are missing a lot of back-and-forth dialogue that helps to really add to emotional conflict and interplay of the voices and of the characters' personalities. The overwhelming majority of speech being done in this book is going to be by Goldmund, the main character. While the book is called Narcissus and Goldmund, I would say you get about 20% Narcissus to about 80% Goldmund if you were to just weigh the two side by side. And then perhaps one little piece that I could say did come from Simon's own vocal performance quality and the narration, and something I didn't necessarily love. It was simply that the city governor's voice, this is Agnes, one of his love interests, one of the main character's love interests, has a husband, and it is the city governor. And the voice given to the city governor is just a bit silly sounding. It is a little too cartoonish and reptilian amidst a cast of highly believable and reeled in voices. Of course, this is an artistic flourish, and it is a very important character, so perhaps giving it something of an otherworldly type of voice just side by side with the entire rest of the cast. Perhaps that is a very important piece of performance, symbolically speaking, but I did sort of cringe at it. That said, despite these little itty-bitty drawbacks and quirks, this was a really remarkable way to take in such a classic novel. So I highly recommend that if you're going to be checking out Narcissus and Goldmund, you could augment this book a lot by incorporating the reading, or you could be like me and just consume it through the narrated version outright. Either way, I recommend it. And I would easily put this narration in the S tier. Simon Vance is clearly a contender for the GOAT in terms of narrators, especially in terms of male narrators. He is clearly a GOAT contender there. I would possibly say that he is not my so far favorite narrator of all time, but I would also hedge that by saying I haven't seen a wide enough variety of his works, and I would be absolutely elated to check out more titles that are narrated by him. He has narrated no small number of them. In fact, in an article formed out of an interview he did with the Pasadena Star-News, it is estimated that Simon has narrated about 1,000 audiobooks, of various types, and Audible alone has around 800 books narrated by him at the time of this recording. Many others were eventually replaced with other editions or came from a particular time, era, and situation where they couldn't as easily make the gap over to the modern digital era of audiobooks, to where they're not going to be as easily available, but they exist in some capacity at some libraries. So 1,000 audiobooks is insane work. I can't even fathom. Of course, it is a long career that he has been working on this. It was around the early 90s that he went full-time into his acting career, shortly following the death of his father, back when he made the move over to the United States more permanently, and has been primarily in Southern California since. So shouts out to Simon's impressive audiobook narration career of 30 plus years. Moving on, I want to talk about the text itself, because this is, of course, a very influential, noteworthy, and remarkable piece of text, and I'm very glad that it got such a wonderful narration. But what exactly is Narcissus and Goldmund? So this is a book taking place in medieval Europe, particularly in the German Empire, around the time of the Black Death or bubonic plague. Just to give you a sort of time frame to reflect the year. The book itself is considered a parable, and it touches on the spiritual versus the sensual. It is a very effective piece of literature in helping one to consider this dichotomy of the ways of life. Goldmund is, of course, our sensual character, and Narcissus is the character that is present primarily at the beginning and end of the novel, but helps to create a framing situation and inspiration for the rest of the novel's events and many of Goldmund's actions that guide the plot of the novel. It's tough to even imagine if I can or should or would spoil anything here by how I want to discuss the book. It was very interesting, gripping, and at times a little bit hard to put down. I almost felt this strange feeling of yearning for it to be a longer book. It was very enjoyable in some strange ways, and in other ways it got a bit tiresome because, of course, to paint this picture of the sensual, artistic, and free-living being, there is going to be a bit of repetition and an almost tiresome amount of clapping. I mean, Goldmund is just out there clapping cheeks like crazy, and it is, of course, important to the novel and important to the experiential sort of guiding plot of the book and the situation and the development. But at times it almost feels cheesy just how quickly he's able to get out there and just shebang with so many women. But it's explained as to exactly why he has the level of appeal and the level of drive and the level of interest and intrigue and passion that he has. And it is not without any sort of pushback of the subconscious, pains of the psyche. It has all of that as well, and that is much appreciated. It is a good contrast. Almost nothing within the book happens without some consequence or some massive symbolism and implications. If you are familiar with various philosophical ideas on transience and sin and what it means to be a good and righteous person and what it means to find purpose in life, various well-circulated, differing philosophical ideas on these topics or answers to these questions, you will feel a lot of influence coming from varied sources and varied perspectives being infused into the experiences and the reflections discussed throughout this book. Essentially, it is just a very well put together fruition of life type of book. It neither paints the picture that the sensual life is the only absolute correct way of living life, nor does it state that the spiritual life, the life in pursuit of enlightenment, is the wrong choice or superior choice either. There is plenty of reflection and food for thought throughout this novel, and I would say that aside from the profuse amount of sex going on in the book, it would actually be a great piece of high school literature or very early college literature. This is one of those pieces of literature that I could have greatly appreciated and possibly benefited from in my late teens or early 20s. At this particular point in my life, it didn't feel like I was taken on the most transformational, life-changing, mind-altering journey. But I think that some could feel this after reading such a book. There was nothing tired or patronizing about it, really, and I'm not going to go full-on literature club and dissect it bit for bit and get extremely critical, but all in all, I found it to be enjoyable, and I found it to be different than virtually anything I expected. I didn't do much past reading a very scant description of the book, and I just jumped right in, so hopefully I've given you a tiny bit more preparation, and you'll have an enjoyable time. I'd love if you'd check it out, and I'd really love if you'd check out some of Simon's works and or his website. Wonderful narrator, truly a privilege and a treat, and as always, it is nothing shy of a humongous treat to get to share these books with you all.
And for next week, we're going to go ahead and check out another book, a novel by Neil Stevenson called Snow Crash, and it was recommended by my friend Strawberry, so thank you Strawberry for that, and thanks again Bui for recommending this. Thank you all for checking these out with me, and it's nothing shy of a pleasure and a treat to get to do this every week. So take care, and I'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.